Yes, thank you. Hi, thank you. Thank you, Tamar. Thank you, Brewery, and thank you, everybody, for being here. One preliminary note, so there is a source sheet. I see one person asked in the chat if there is a source sheet. I'll be sharing it in the course of our discussion this evening. But if there's some way to, I wondered, Tamar, just if there's a way to share it with everyone beforehand or send it out in the chat or something.
Yeah, I'll look into it right now. I'll look into it and I'm
great. So thank you. So it's lovely. I can't say it's lovely to see you because we're live streaming, and so I don't get to see all of you, but I know you're there. And so thank you all. Indeed. We're now at the close of Gimel Elul, the 85th yard site of Rav Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, Zecher Tzadik Kadosh Livracha. Rav Kook is a huge figure, to put it mildly. Rav Kook is, in the pantheon of great Jewish thinkers, a towering figure, jurist, mystic, philosopher, poet, rabbi, communal leader. It is hard to think of a rabbinic figure whose not just whose public activities, but whose theology has had such profound impact on politics and society and concrete issues of politics and diplomacy, as have his ideas. He is deeply revered and deeply controversial. In some respects, maybe the most radical Jewish thinker of modern times, one of the most radical Jewish thinkers since Maimonides. Like all great Jewish thinkers, lo bichdi, not for nothing do I mention people of the caliber of the Rambam, and we'll also think about the Gaon Vilna, the Baal Shem Tov. Like all these great thinkers, he had this very unique mix of profound faithfulness to the tradition, along with great and at times audacious creativity and courage. We often know who is Rav Kook, what was Rav Kook. Well, the standard facts are that he was the founding chief rabbi of the Jews, the founder of the modern chief rabbinate, and first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of modern day Eretz Yisrael, and the leading theologian of religious Zionism. Now, of course, that's true, but in many ways, I've often thought that I've been studying Rav Kook for many, many years, and I often think that in some ways those are the least interesting things about him. Because so much of what makes Rav Kook such a riveting figure is that this is somebody who tried to take upon himself all the different, complex, competing, often contradictory strains of Jewish tradition, Jewish intellectual and spiritual tradition, and of Jewish life in modern times, and try to create some sort of synthesis of them all. I see in the chat, as I mentioned, people are thinking of other large figures like Abraham Joshua Heschel, and yes, that's great. And actually, in our last meeting, it might be very interesting to compare him with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. They're both colossal figures in their respective communities of North America and Israel, and it's very interesting and instructive to think about the differences between them. But for now, we're talking about Rav Kook. So I'd like to start with a preliminary text, and one that's not by him and perhaps a little surprising. So first, what I'm going to do is here we have, I hope you can all see the source sheet that I put together. I'd like to do just a brief chronology of Rav Kook's life. As we'll see, he's born in 1865 and passes away in 1935. Just stop and think for a moment at everything that transpires between those years. 1865, for the North Americans among us, we all think 1865, well, that's the year of the end of the American Civil War. 1935 is 2 years into the rise of Hitler. Think of the remarkable changes and transformations in the world between 1865 and 1935. Changes in technology and communication and transportation, in massive population movements, especially of Jews. World War I. So much happens in these years, and they all register on our book. He's born in 1865. I'll be talking about that, about his childhood. In 1884, he goes to learn in Volozhin, the greatest of Eastern European yeshivot. In 1886, he's married to Bachelata Rabinovich, to Omin. In 1888, he takes his first rabbinical post in a little shtetl called Zaimel. His wife dies, he remarries. In 1896, he moves to his second rabbinical post in a much larger town called Bois. In 1904, he moves to Eretz Yisrael and becomes chief rabbi of Jaffa in the agricultural colonies, and becomes involved very much in all sorts of ways with the revolutionary figures of the second Aliyah, where he becomes major figures in the history of Zionism. 1910, the controversy over there are many controversies in which he's involved. In 1910 in particular, a controversy over how properly to observe Shemitah. We'll talk about that a little bit. In 1914, in the summer of 1914, he travels to Europe and gets stuck there during World War I. He's there for the duration. In 1917 is the Balfour Declaration. Balfour Declaration is, of course, incredibly important to the history of Zionism and Jewish history, but also very important for him because it validates his reading of modern Jewish history as actually a pre-Messianic time. In 1919, he returns to the land of Israel and becomes chief rabbi of Jerusalem. In 1921, founds the chief rabbinate, becomes the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi. In 1935, he passes away and is buried not far from here. I can see it on the Mount of Olives. Now, what we're going to talk about this evening are these early years, 1865 to about 1910 or so. Now, in light of all that happens later, as always, we have this tendency to project it back onto people and onto events a sense of inevitability, right? And often when one reads things written by Rav Kook, well, it seems almost inevitable that he could become a great gadol, and that he becomes a great patron of Zionism, and that he would become this great theologian of Jewish nationalism and of Eretz Yisrael, after all, right? So the seeds of this must have been there in the beginning. And they were perhaps, but they weren't quite obvious. And there's a fascinating testimony to that. And this is the first text we're going to look at. It's written by a figure some of you may have heard of, named Yitzchak Nissenbaum. It's not very famous, so don't feel guilty or anything inadequate if you haven't heard of him before. But Yitzchak Nissenbaum in his time was a very well-known figure in the world of religious Zionism, and was the personal secretary to Shmuel Moller. Was this very gifted orator and writer and journalist and political activist who eventually was murdered in the Holocaust. In 1929, Yitzchak Nissenbaum writes a memoir called Alei Fildi, and he talks about his meeting with Abraham Isaac Kook. I'd heard of Rav Kook's appointment as rabbi of Yahoo, right? And so he said he takes note of him. And I knew what a large role a rabbi like this would play in the development of the Yishuv and the development of the Jewish community of Palestine. But I was not terribly interested in this rabbi. He had taken no part in Kibbutz Zion, sort of the early, sort of like pre-Zionist movement that was created in Eastern Europe, like 19th century. We'll talk a little bit about that. Or later Zionism. He hadn't written important books. So what would I have had to do with him? So this is so interesting, right? We think of Rav Kook as this colossal figure, this incredibly important figure in the history of Zionism, the Yishuv, and everything like that. And here you have a guy, Yitzchak Nissenbaum, who is like at the heart of religious Zionist activity in Eastern Europe in the later part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. And he says, I heard that Abraham Isaac Kook becomes chief rabbi in Jaffa and was going to go to Eretz Yisrael. And that's kind of interesting because I'd never heard of him. He wasn't part of our circles. He hadn't been involved in all this early Zionist activity. He hadn't written books that were published that one had taken note of. Though, as we'll see, he'd written a great deal. Just sort of look at his publishing in those years. So what would I have to do with it? So I decided to be in the rabbis, in the new rabbi's home and get a proper sense of them, right? He goes to visit Rabbi Kook in the town of Beis, spends, right? And he says, I spent 3 days in the city of Beis and spent several hours each day in the rabbi's home. And we discussed again, apologies for the typos, speedily done this afternoon. And we discussed various matters in halakha, agadah, and life questions. I saw before me no ordinary rabbi following well-worn paths, but a man of the spirit, paving his own way. He hadn't found it yet, but was searching for it in all the length and breadth of Judaism. He was diving into the seas of the Talmuds, Midrashim, philosophy, Kabbalah, Hasidism, and the new Hebrew literature, and bringing up precious stones with which to pave his way. By the way, this photo that you're now seeing, it's on my home screen, and it's a photo that I snapped of Rav Kook's study in Beit Rav Kook here in Yerushalayim. Okay, so what do we see from this brief passage? We see from this brief passage, this figure, this activist, this intellectual, Yitzhak Nissenbaum, had never heard of Rav Kook, right? But he observed that he was a questing soul, and that this was no ordinary rabbi. This was no, right, okay, I see there was no photo. Sorry, when I shut the screen share, I saw my own home screen, but you can see it, that's fine. At any rate, this was no ordinary rabbi. He notices a key thing, he's a very keen observer, that this is a rabbi who's trying to synthesize all the different elements of Jewish tradition. Talks about philosophy, talks about Kabbalah, talks about Talmud, talks about Halakha, and he's interested in modern culture, and he's trying to put together some unique synthesis of his own. So who is he and where is he and where does he come from? So he's born in 1865 in a little shtetl called Griva, which is in present-day Latvia. But you know, for our purposes, and for purposes of Jewish cultural history, Lithuania, Lita, right? And those of us who are familiar with these things know that Lita is in the 19th century the nerve center of East European Jewry. It's the center of scholarship. It's the center of learning. It's crucial, of course, for rabbinic culture, for Talmudic culture. It's the home of these great yeshivot, these great Talmudic academies. And when it comes to Hasidism, it's the home of Chabad, right? And it's important to remember about Chabad, that Chabad, today we're familiar with Chabad as it's developed in the last half century or so, which is this sort of very outreachy sort of organization. Chabad has always had emissaries and was always all over the place. But the Chabad that we know, like being on every street corner and handing out, you know, tefillin and Shabbos candles and so on and so forth, is a fairly recent development in the history of Hasidism in general, sort of Chabad Hasidism. I mean, it's one with its own rich history we can talk about at length, but what's crucial to know is that, what are the initials, after all, of Chabad? Chokhmah, Binah, Da, right? Wisdom, understanding, knowledge, which are both nice and worthy thoughts, and also very crucial in Kabbalistic terminology. The point is that Chabad was the intellectuals' Hasidut. It was the scholastic Hasidut. And the family into which Avram Yitzchak Kook was born was on the one side straight Litvak, Misnagid, anti-Chassid, and on the other Chabad. On his father's side, straight Mitnagdic lineage all down the line, and on his mother's side, Chabad Hasidism. Indeed, when the third Lubavitch Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, passed away, his disciples distributed, so to speak, his relics. And Rav Kook's maternal grandfather got a button and a few pieces of thread from the Tzemach Tzedek's Bekesh and gave them to his daughter, and who wove them into a yarmulke for her little son. In later years, Rav Kook recalled that his parents would have this playful running argument. You know, when he grew up, would he become some Lithuanian Litvak style Rosh Yeshiva, Talmudist, or would he become a Hasidic Rebbe, right? Sort of charismatic, spiritual, mystical sort of figure carrying through the flock. It's a wonderful story, just to see these parents observing their young son who, from an early age, seemed to march to a different drama, didn't fit into any of the obvious categories. And also because, in many ways, it's true. They were both right. He grows up to become this like master Talmudist and head of Yeshiva, and he also becomes this remarkable, mystic, charismatic, Kabbalist figure and communal leader, but not in conventional terms of either a Rosh Yeshiva or a Hasidic Rebbe. This we see throughout. He's a child prodigy. He's very, very bright from a very early age, already at the age of 9 or so. His father, Shalom Salman Kook. His mother was named Carol Zlotko. And his father, Shlomo Zalman Kook, decides that he pretty much has nothing more to teach him, and so he sends him across the river to Dvinsk, which is a large industrial town right across the river from their suburb of Riva. By the way, one other Jewish figure from Riva is, of all people, that was born a generation after Rav Kook, was the artist Mark Rothko. And the abstract expression is Rothko. And I always love to mention that because if you know anything about Rothko's paintings, they're fused with these sort of remarkable, there's this like mystical vision of light. And the fact that like these two great Jewish light mystics, Rav Kook and Rothko, both came from the same shtetl, you know, indicates that nothing else like the sun sets there must have been really sun. At any rate, he studies with the rabbi of Dvinsk, Reuben Levin, and he's a very important, you know, very interesting Talmudist and halachist. And then he starts making the rounds. Most young Talmudists of that time didn't study in the big yeshivot, or if they did, they were only for a little while. And most rabbinic study took place in local Batei Midrash, local rabbis, and indeed our Mr. Kook starts going to one or the other. And there's one town where he lives for years called Luda, where there's also a cousin of his father's, who's a traditional-minded maskil, right? Because I've mentioned Hasidism, I've mentioned Lithuanian Talmudism, and the third other large ideological movement coursing through Eastern European in general, specifically, and of course Russian Jewry, in particular in these years is Haskalah, the movement for Jewish enlightenment. So the movement for Jewish enlightenment seeks to modernize Jewry, not for Jewry to assimilate itself, right, but to remake itself. You know, throughout, I mean, Haskalah says that, you know, this Haskalah de-emphasizes the study of Talmud and emphasizes the study of Bible and grammar and philosophy and history and, you know, natural science and all that kind of thing. With now, throughout Jewish history, though, there were these very humanistically minded rabbis who were studying grammar. I mean, anybody who's ever opened up a Mikra Gedolot and sees the commentary of Ibn Ezra, well, they're staring you right in the face as a rabbi who's immersed in grammar and philosophy. Right? So what's the big deal? The difference is that Haskalah, where sort of a classical rabbinic humanism shifts off and becomes Haskalah, becomes enlightenment, is when sort of these aspects of the traditional Jewish curriculum, A, are put in the foreground, and B, celebrated as part of a program to change Jewish life and modernize it and make it more adapted to modernity. And modernity is barreling through in these years, in the 1860s, the 1870s, right? Great changes are happening, obviously, in the world, and they're also happening in Eastern Europe. Jews are facing all kinds of challenges. On the one hand, doors are opening up throughout Europe in the form of enlightenment, emancipation, and so on. At the same time, there's great political turmoil in Europe. It's sort of, you know, there's the revolutions of 1848, a few years before this board, and then over in the 1860s and 70s, Russian liberalism as a social force in the Russian Empire, a social force that is trying to create Western European style liberalism in the Russian Empire, is also making itself felt. And you're finding this among rabbis who are starting, traditional rabbis who have no intention of going anywhere in the direction of Reform Judaism, nonetheless experimenting with ideas of openness to general culture and enlightenment and political and social liberalization. By the end of the 1870s, liberalism runs aground in Russian society in general, right? Sort of the reform-minded czars are gone, and Russian policy becomes very reactionary, and Russian Jewry in general becomes radicalized. That's why starting in 1880, you start getting official anti-Semitism in the form of pogroms. You have intensification of difficult living conditions in the Pale of Settlement, and so Jews are more driven into poverty. You start having mass migration of Jews outward to Western Europe and to North America and some to Palestine. And rabbis who were looking to introduce positive change into Jewish life pulled back from liberalism and started thinking about what today we call Zionism, right? That may be the way to revitalize and regenerate Jewish life. Because also remember, like, Jewish institutions were crumbling in Eastern Europe. Jewish communities are being successively stripped of the authority that they used to have over their own communities, and they're being driven into poverty. We'll hold that thought for a moment. And so you have rabbis and maskilim who are starting to look towards the idea of Jewish settlement in Zion, not necessarily an idea towards creating any kind of state there, but creating some sort of Jewish presence there that will be both culturally vibrant and economically vibrant and could lead to some sort of revitalization of Jewish life. And in Eastern Europe, that's best known under the banner of the movement of Shivat Zion, the Lovers of Zion, in the 1880s. Now, this is the atmosphere in which Rav Kook is growing up, and it's in this time that he goes to study in the yeshiva in Volozhin. Finally, right in 1886, he goes to the yeshiva in Volozhin, and let me, I have some. Here, 1 second, as I just sort of move. Now, this is his master in, here, let me sort of move this little dude here. Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who is the head of the yeshiva in Volozhin, the dean of the yeshiva of Volozhin. Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin is a remarkable figure. He's a very gifted administrator. He's a fantastic scholar and Talmudist. He's also a scholar of Bible, which is rare for Lithuanian Talmudists. He's a supporter in guarded terms of Shivat Zion. And he's also somebody who's interested in Haskalah and Maskilic literature, especially earlier in his literary career. And in Volozhin, Rav Kook is thrust into a remarkably intense atmosphere. Volozhin is the first modern yeshiva. What do we mean by that? They were all yeshivot, all through Jewish history. But Volozhin, founded in 1802 by Chaim Volozhin, is something like a modern university. It gathers many students from all over to study full-time in an intense atmosphere with stipends, with no expectation that they will go on to become communal rabbis. It's an institution meant to realize the ideal of Torah Lishma, Torah study for its own sake, which is a crucial feature, of course, in the teachings of the Gaon of Vilna. Crucially, right, the Rosh Yeshiva is not necessarily the rabbi of the town. And indeed, I'm saying this not just because she's one of our organizers tomorrow, or Tamar Stanford's father, Shaul Stanford, is the leading historian of modern East European yeshivot, as the first he's demonstrated this most vividly, that these yeshivot are very much modern institutions, right? The same way in which, I teach at Brandeis University, the president of Brandeis University is not the mayor of Waltham. The head of the yeshiva in the great Lithuanian yeshivot is not the rabbi of the town, right? It's a place of pure study. And so you have, Volozhin is a magnet for all kinds of talented, intense young men. It's like a greenhouse. It's like a hothouse of ideas. And all the ideological issues of the day, Jewish nationalism, Zionism, early Zionism, socialism, revolutionary ideas, Hasidism, attraction to Haskalah, fierce opposition to Hasidism, all come together in the personae of the students in Volozhin. Let's look at two students who were exact contemporaries of Rav Kook in Volozhin. Michael Yosef Berdichevsky. Michael Yosef Berdichevsky grew up in, some of you may be familiar with the name, Berdichevsky grew up in a Hasidic family. Eventually, he was kicked out of his father-in-law's house for studying philosophy, but went to study in Volozhin. In Volozhin, he wore talit and tefillin all day. After leaving Volozhin, he became one of the great Jewish revolutionaries of the time. Berdichevsky was the person who literally and figuratively translated Nietzsche into Hebrew. Berdichevsky, as among early, was sort of the enfant terrible of modern Jewish culture. Berdichevsky was the person who argued that there was no such thing as Judaism, that Judaism was simply something that was forced by the rabbis onto the masses, and as Berdichevsky famously wrote in an important essay, we must decide, will we become the last Jews or the first Hebrews, right? He was one of the advocates, or if you will, prophets of a modern Hebrew culture that would be in open revolt against Jewish tradition and thus revive the Jewish people. Another student in Voloshin at the time is Zelig Reuven Bengus. Zelig Reuven Bengus, many years later, comes in Aliyah to Yerushalayim, is one of the most important Dayanim in Yerushalayim. Now, he's interesting because of a story about him and his classmate, Rav Kook. Young men in Voloshin, like Berdichevsky, who were attracted to Haskalah, would often be reading literature, poetry, etc., in their rooms, and sometimes even in the Beit Midrash. They would like sneak in newspapers and journals and sneak them in under their volumes of Talmud. Zelig Reuven Bengus noticed that young Avraham Kook, who, unlike many students at Voloshin, had a beard, davened with great intensity, like a chassid, but learned very intensely, like a misnagid, but also had a bunch of papers underneath his Talmud that he kept glancing at. And Zelig Bengus went and talked to the Netziv and said, I think Avraham Kook is an apikoros. I think he's a heretic. I think he's one of these closet maskilin, because he keeps looking at other papers during learning time. The Netziv, Naftali Tzvi of Berlin, said to him, leave him alone, he's a tzaddik. But Bengus wasn't entirely convinced. And one time when Avraham Kook goes to, leaves his gender for a couple of minutes, Bengus runs over, takes a look, opens up his Talmud, sees what does he have in these pieces of paper underneath, and underneath he had written the line from Tehillim and from the Sidur, Shiviti Hashem Lenegdi Tanit. I have placed God before me always. So you see, even at this young age, people don't quite know what to make of Avraham Kook. He seems, indeed, he was very open to modern ideas. The Netziv, who we mentioned earlier, when young men in Voloshin were having problems of faith, he used to tell them, go talk to Avraham Kook. He's a good person to talk to about these things. He learned intensely. He learned like a litvak. He davened like a chassid. He seemed to be open to maskilic ideas, and he was all of them and none of them at the same time, in a way that people found perplexing. And yet when they tried to catch him out, it turned out that he was somehow on some deeper religious quest. So, shortly after leaving Voloshin, he marries. We don't have a photo of his first wife, but this is his father-in-law, Eliyahu David Rabinovich Teomi, also known as the Aderet. Aderet was a highly respected rabbi. He was the Rabbi of Panovich. And he writes in his memoir, Seder Eliyahu, about how remarkably taken he was with Avraham Kook. One of the things, frankly, that was striking is that he had trouble finding husbands for his daughters, because shul rabbis were paid miserably in 19th century Europe. And Avraham Kook and his parents weren't looking for money. And this theme that goes throughout Kook's life. And before actually he becomes, they meet before Avraham Kook goes off to Voloshin. He goes up to Voloshin, they meet, and he becomes engaged to his daughter Batsheva, and they're married after Avraham Kook finishes yeshiva. They moved to Panovich. In Panovich, financial troubles descend immediately. Generally speaking, being a shul rabbi in the 19th century Eastern Europe, as I said, it was like really not a good deal. Balabatim regularly withheld salaries. The Aderet himself sometimes had to go on the expedient of what was called a psak strike, where he would refuse to answer halakhic questions until his salary was paid, sort of like a little bit of the Arab socialism breezing through. And so Avraham Kook is forced to take a rabbinical post. He's forced to take a rabbinical post in a town called Zion, but not before he starts getting to work. In the early years of his marriage, he publishes a journal called Itur Sofrim, the Scribe's Garland. And it's a very impressive journal. In it, Hebrew and Yiddish periodical culture of the time was remarkably intense. If you go to the website of the Sifriyah Leumit, the National Library of Israel, you'll see there's like a magnificent database of like the Jewish Historical Newspapers Project. And you can see in Hebrew, in Yiddish, in all kinds of languages, remarkable diversity of publications, just this incredible wealth of Jewish writing and publication and journalism that's going on in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And Rav Kook wants to be part of it. And he puts together this journal. He gets articles for it from some remarkably distinguished figures, from his father-in-law, from the Nitzir, from Yishuv Inspector, the chief posek in Lithuania at the time, and other figures. And he writes a lot of articles himself. And in these articles, he says that, he hopes that through the medium of the modern periodical, we'll be able to restore the kind of dialogic back and forth that characterized rabbinic literature in Torah Sheba'al in its early years. And interestingly, he lays out this program for how to think about halakha. In these early years, Rav Kook is fascinated by Maimonides. Fascinated by Maimonides. We tend, what does this great mystic have to do with Maimonides? If you read Rav Kook's early writings, the Jewish thinker that he quotes the most is Maimonides, in all sorts of ways. And here, Maimonides' influence shows up in Torah Sofrim in two ways. The first, he writes a whole bunch of essays about how halakha needs to be rationalized and systematized and properly laid out and properly indexed, which is interesting because in this time, not only in Jewish circles, but throughout Europe and also including in the Ottoman Empire, a lot of people are writing about how old and regularly old law systems, and especially religiously based law systems, need to be revised, rationalized, systematized, etc., to be made fit for modern societies. He writes about the same way Maimonides in his classic work Yad Chazakah Mishneh Torah rationalized and systematized and classified and philosophized halakha. So we have to do the same today. And he writes about Maimonides' doctrine of prophecy. Right, Maimonides in the Mishneh Torah and his philosophical works paid a lot of attention to the idea of the prophet and how, and Maimonides had what we call a naturalistic conception of prophecy, where prophecy isn't just something that happens, and it's not something that's just bestowed on the prophet by God's will, but something towards which one can work, towards which you can prepare yourself, right? And sort of for Maimonides, the philosophy, the prophet is the person who has attained perfection, shleimut, hold on to that word because we're going to come back to it, has attained shleimut in body, in soul, and in intellect, and thus prepare themselves for prophecy, which, depending on how you interpret Maimonides, either just then naturally happens or makes the person a fit vessel for God to bestow prophecy upon them, which is how Rav Kook tends to see. So he puts out one issue of this journal. He manages to push out while he's become a rabbi of the shtetl, and along the way he's ordained by Michael Epstein, the author of the magnum opus Aruch HaShulchan, and it's his brother-in-law. And the second issue of Yehuda Sofrim is the last, because his wife passes away. And here is his tombstone. His wife passes away at a young age of pneumonia after giving birth to a child, a daughter. And he's rather bereft and crushed after the death of his first wife. He remarries not long afterwards to one of her cousins, very much at the urging of Aderet, his father-in-law, who loves him dearly and doesn't want to lose him as a son-in-law. But anyways, he goes on mourning his wife for years, writes elegies to her and stuff. Now, what becomes very interesting is that with the time of the death of his first wife, we also start seeing a bit of a shift in that, as a young man out of yeshiva, he's sort of coming out of the gates with this very ambitious program of publication and so forth. Then for a number of years, he goes silent, hardly publishes, with one exception that we'll see. And the tone of his writing and thinking shifts. He starts reading less philosophy and more Kabbalah, more in the mystical tradition. He goes and studies Kabbalah with Rabbi Yishuv, not the Rabbi Yishuv who passed away a few years ago, his grandfather, was a great Lithuanian Kabbalist. By the way, Lithuanian Kabbalist, yes. We tend to think of Kabbalah and mysticism as a very Hasidic line of inquiry in modern times. And yet, the Gaon of Vilna, the culture hero of Lithuanian Talmudism, the archmitnaged, the founder of a principled opposition to Hasidism, wrote as much in Kabbalah as he did in Halakha and even more. And in some ways was a more classical Kabbalist than Hasidism. I mean, this becomes a whole conversation. But basically, Hasidism very much took Kabbalistic categories and internalized them and made them maps for the study of the individual soul. The Vilna Gaon retained a more classical conception of Kabbalah as being very much about God's inner life and a bit less so about the individual's inner life. Rav Kook changes that. But studying Lithuanian Kabbalah, and especially the works of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, was a hallmark of this school, of what we call Kabbalah Litaic, Lithuanian Kabbalah. It was a fixed school, but it was people who saw themselves as the disciples of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon works set, including his works on Kabbalah, set the terms for their investigation. So this Kabbalah of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was very important. We'll talk about that. And they were not Hasidic. And he starts immersing himself in this sort of Kabbalah. And he also starts writing a journal. Now, this is really interesting. In history of Jewish spiritual writing, Jewish mysticism, we tend not to have much in the way of spiritual diaries for a whole bunch of reasons. With a few limited exceptions starting from modern times, like Chaim Vital, the disciple of the Ari, the chief disciple of the Ari, has a Sefer Chezionot, the book of the vision. Rav Kook starts keeping a journal. And in his journal is the first journal that he kept was published a few years ago under the title Mitziot Katan, in a wonderful edition by Koren Publishing House. It starts like, a standard rabbinic journal with his writing Kiddushay Torah, his insights on different Talmudic passages, and the beginnings of a commentary on Shulchan Aruch that he starts to write. But then it starts becoming a very meditative work. And parts would seem to be like treatises, ideas for essays or treatises that he would like to write about this or that aspect of Jewish thought. But after all, it just becomes thoughts and reflections and thoughts, including reflections and thoughts on himself, on his own soul, and what observing his own soul teaches him about himself and about the world. Now, while this is going on, he does publish one work in these years. And I will get it for you here. A moment. No, not here. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I don't entirely have that. Here. Okay, great. Chevish Pe'er. Chevish Pe'er, sort of like the turban of glory. This is a small book about the importance of the mitzvah of tefillin in general, and especially tefillin shel rosh, tefillin that are worn on the head. And it's a small, passionate treatise about the importance of the proper placement of tefillin shel rosh and the deficiency of tefillin being improperly placed on the head. Now, where on this page do you see his name? You don't see it anywhere. He published this anonymously, right? He published it under a pseudonym, Kohen Da'ato Yefeh. Sort of, it's a line from rabbinic literature that, but in this context, I think is best translated as a priest of immaculate mind. Usually called Kohen Da'ato Yefeh. Means like, a Kohen's like understanding will be clear, and it sort of also means like Kohen Da'ato Yefeh is also in rabbinic literature in case that a well-groomed priest knows how to observe the laws of purity and proper comportment. He goes and he undertakes a kind of pilgrimage, preaching on this text, not saying that he's doing it on behalf of the author who chooses to remain anonymous. And he goes to a bunch of places and preaches on it, and only later does the cat camera come out of the bag that it's him. Now it's a very strange sort of book, right? Why devote this whole impassioned treatise to the proper placement of tefillin shel rosh? There are all kinds of things going on. But if you take a look at, in his notebook, Mitziot Katan, we see the sermons we see texts that also became sermons that he preached on while he was doing this tefillin pilgrimage of his. And he's fascinated with the relationship of the body to the mind. He's fascinated with the relationship between the body and the mind. And so he sees Tefillin Shel Rosh as the point of connection between the mind and the body. And that's why you really need to get it right. Now, where this becomes more than a point of religious practice as such is when we see what goes on in his journals, and then eventually in a small book of sermons that he writes called Midbar Shur, which he writes in around 1894, 1890, in the years 1895, 1896. In Midbar Shur, he takes up the idea of perfection, flourishing, wholeness, which is key to the classical philosophical tradition, Greek philosophy, and so on, and key to Jewish philosophical tradition. And he's fascinated in his early writings between the relationship between body and soul, and between Jewish morality and non-Jewish morality. Now, what does this have to do with Zionism and all of that? Well, think about it for a moment. The relationship of body and soul. What's Jewish nationalism going to do about? Going to be about restoring the Jewish body to the physical limit of Israel.
Professor Mirsky,
Yes.
Professor Mirsky, we can't hear you. Maybe something disconnected.
I'm still here. I'm still here. Can you hear me now?
Now I can. Yeah. Okay. I hope it's
Okay,
getting
great.
started.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry I was cutting in and out. Anyway, so like, this all sounds very abstract and philosophical, I know. But what I want to get at here is, yes, Rav Kook is going to be like a very profound and influential thinker about issues of Jewish nationalism and Zionism and all this kind of thing. But at the foundations for him are these profound philosophical and theological questions about the relationship between the body and the soul, the Jewish body and the Jewish soul, and between Jewish identity and non-Jewish identity, and Jewish morals and non-Jewish morals, or if you will, in a language, to use the language that we use today, the particular and the universal. He's going to be obsessed with the question of what is the relationship between body and soul, and what is the relationship between the universal in particular in God's world. Because remember, he's very much, and he increasingly more and more is drawn into the world of the Kabbalah, both as a doctrine and as a way of looking into the world. And in many respects, so much of what he's about is a vast unpacking of a fundamental idea that's in the Kabbalah, expressed in Tikkunei Zohar, part of the literature of the Zohar, the classic works of Jewish mysticism. Let atar panui minei la ilah v'la tata. There is no place devoid of God, neither above nor below. If you really believe in God, if you believe God is everywhere and in everything, then God must also be somehow in the world. God must be in all these different elements of the world. God must be in non-Jews too. Well, how does that work? And how does that work from a framework of traditional Jewish life committed to halakha? Because he's very committed to halakha. So let's return for a second to his classmate Berdichevsky. In Rav Kook's early years, where is okay? We'll get to this section. Just point out Berdichevsky, who I talked about earlier. Throughout those early years, he and Berdichevsky are writing things, and they're regularly responding to the same issues. They're responding to questions of how to revise halakha. They're responding to what should be the curriculum in yeshivot. They're responding to how should Jews rethink their identity. And then every step of the way, Berdichevsky says we need to break, we need to revolt, we need rupture. And at every step of the way, Rav Kook says, let me step back and get a little more complicated here. Let me look a little more deeply into things. Let me try to be more all-encompassing. So now here, in this work of, in this book of sermons, he says basically there are two kinds, here I'll summarize this in the interest of time. He says there are two kinds of human flourishing, wholeness, perfection. The first is natural, right, as he says here. The first is that God has given us understanding and reason and made us righteous in terms of more natural traits. The second is the perfection of man, which one can obtain by clinging to divine virtues through Torah and mitzvot, which God gave Israel, the nation close to him. Right? That's how he parses the difference between the Noahide commandments and the 613 mitzvot. There is the natural world. The natural world, the world as we know it. There's not only the natural world of like rocks, trees, there's also the natural world of the spirit. There's the natural world of morals. There's natural morality. And we'll see who's going to talk about that. We have moral intuitions. We have basic ethical ideas that appeal to and are binding on all human beings. And on top of that, we have the Torah. Jews participate in this natural morality of humanity, and they have something more that takes it to a different place, that elevates it above the natural towards the divine. And this is going to be the framework, this is the starting point of the framework, which is going to think about many things, including in Jewish nationalism, the revival of the Jewish body. And the revival of the Jewish people as a nation that shares things with other peoples. Now, in these early years, he doesn't, as we said, you know, he doesn't, he's not very involved in Zionism. Again, he's very introspective. Here's a passage from his journals in these early years. The foundation of tikkun, right, repair and restoration of the world, is to organize everything and every power, be it in the soul or the world, justly in its place, and not to reverse order, and prevent the effluence, the flowing of divine forces and energies. And here's the verse from the Bible that quotes more than any in his early years. God, from Ecclesiastes, Sefer Kohelet, God made man in the world straight, Yashar, with the plenitude of powers and means necessary for perfection, wholeness of body and soul, to do good, and to intellect. And one who undoes the order derived from his government ravages and destroys. One of the personal dramas that is going on in his life, he writes about it in his journals, he likes learning non-halachic things. He loves learning the parts of the Talmud that have nothing to do with law. Now, as many of you know, in traditional rabbinic culture, this is looked down upon, right? If you look in traditional rabbinic culture, what's Agadah? Agadah is what you teach women and children, and that's not meant in a happy way, right? He finds himself drawn to this, and he sees that he loves it. And he begins to conclude, well, I'm drawn to this. Maybe God wants me to study this. Maybe my soul is tending in this direction. And he says this explicitly. If one finds in himself this great desire for God, that like, I can't bear to learn Gemara now, I need to pray. I need to go out and do Milut Chasadim because I want to get close to God. You have to respect that because, in a cosmic sense, like my mother used to tell me when she wanted me to clean up my room, a place for everything and everything in its place. Now, his first thoughts on Jewish nationalism are published, his first published thoughts, appear 1901, 1904 in a journal called Havel, which is a journal, a rabbinic journal, an avowedly anti-Zionist. Now, most rabbis of the time tend to fall into one or two camps regarding Zionism. A large number of Orthodox rabbis at the time basically are appalled by Zionism, right? You know, Theodor Herzl, who's this avowedly secular Jew, who's never held a siddur in his life, sets himself up as the Messiah. Also, like, throws away centuries of practice of okay, I see a lot of you are having trouble with the computer. Let me take out my, if I undo this. Do you hear me better now, folks?
I think so.
Better? Now that I sort of got my earplugs, I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think.
Okay, great. We'll know better for next time. Thank you. So most Orthodox rabbis of the time are either opposed to Zionism because it's secular, because it's godless, because it's like, you know, rabbinic wisdom taught for centuries that the way to survive in exile is by staying low and not engaging in political activism vis-a-vis the Gentiles. And by the way, who decides when exile ends? God decides when it ends. And when does exile end? When Israel repents. How is Israel, how does that vision of redemption have anything to do with this like totally assimilated Viennese playwright? You have some rabbis, especially those who are affiliated with Kibbutz Yom, who basically say, well, you know, of the different schemes on offer, of the different schemes on offer to ameliorate Jewish political, social, and economic disability, Zionism seems to be the best one, but please don't try to convince us that this is about reviving Jewish culture and spirituality. Let's just keep that out. And Rav Kook in these articles, takes out a position saying, actually, well, no, Jewish nationalism, and he doesn't necessarily mean Zionism, because Zionism is not the only kind of Jewish nationalism there at the time. And he doesn't talk much about the land of Israel. Jewish nationalism might actually be a vehicle for restoring Jewish culture. Right? He's fascinated in these years. He's fascinated in these years by these principled rebels with whom he went to Yishuv. And he knows from his conversations with them, remember, the Rosh Yeshiva used to send the students who were having crises of faith to talk to him. And he knows that people like Berdichevsky or Chaim Nachman Bialik or people or similar figures are spiritual seekers. They're motivated by real moral passions, by real social passions. They're motivated by deep concern for the future of the Jewish people. And he's not about to dismiss all of that. Now, but does this mean he's signing on to nationalism? Again, this is really important to notice, and it's really striking in light of his later life. The land of Israel hardly ever appears in his writings before his move to Palestine in 1904. Hardly ever shows up. The Jewish people is a category of analysis from the beginning. And here we see in his very early writings on Zionism. Right? Remember on nationalism. Remember he said there's like nature and then there's that which comes above it. So there's a kind of nationalism that's natural. So long as national feeling proceeds from the well of nature alone, it cannot become mixed with gross love, disproportionate self-love, in other words, chauvinism. Right? He's drawn to nationalism as a source of identity. He sees, like many, or he thinks, like many 19th century thinkers do, late 19th, early 20th century thinkers do, that national identity is a crucial feature of being human, that sort of this Enlightenment ideal of being a man in general with no attachment to any particular nation, culture, or place, or people in particular is a mirage. Right? That there's a vital dynamic element to being human, but he thinks it can't be left untutored as sort of raw material because that is morally treacherous, right? Now, nationalism ought properly to return to us not as a natural feeling alone, but as a pure intellectual concept from the very founding of Israel, fittingly joined to the telos of our witnessing mission to all of humanity. Right? This first essay of his, the first essay in which he comes out as a supporter of Jewish nationalism, is called Tudat Yisrael Ulu. Right? Israel's destiny or Israel's mission and its nationalism. Our nationalism in the spirit of Torah is saved from the riot-causing idiocy of nationalismus. Right? He says Le'umiyut is not nationalism. Divorced from the righteous path. Nationalism, which has no feeling more exalted than itself from which to draw life, and life can easily turn into self-love in a gross and ugly way. God's desire for the development of all humanity by our perfections, that there may follow and train the development of every creature, and the paths of Torah, which alone can secure our special qualities, they alone are the paths leading to the exalted mission of Israel, which is God's desire in our world. Right? So, he's supportive of the idea of nationalism as a basis of Jewish identity, but it must be founded in Torah. Why? Because nationalism itself could be profoundly unethical. And so you see how his early philosophical musings on body and soul and natural morality and Torah morality are now coming into play in how he's starting to think about nationalism. And here's just one last text from his time. As I said, he was like fascinated by the study of Agadah. Commentary on the Aggadic portions of the Talmud, tractates Brachot and Shabbat, called Binayah. And here he quotes a passage which is very famous from the Siddur. Amar Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Hanania, Talmidei Chachamim Rabim Shalom Ba'olam, Shneimar Chovanei Achem Shem Rav Shalom Banai, V'Tidur B'nai Chovanei. Right? Amar Rabbi Elazar said in the name of Rabbi Hanina, sages increase peace in the world. As it's written, all your children should be students of God, and great peace to your children. Do not read your children, but bonai, those who understand. Now, basically, I'll summarize here. He summarizes and says, how exactly do sages preserve peace? Open a page of the Talmud, and what's it? A record of arguments. Walk into a Beit Midrash, and what do you see? People arguing with one another. What does any of this have to do with increasing peace? And he says, peace is not uniformity of opinion. That's the peace of the graveyard. Everybody agreeing, like the Monty Python sketch, you all have to think for yourselves. Yes, we all have to think for ourselves, right? That's not peace, that's death. Peace is God's name, because only God can unify all the opposites, and God is about unifying opposites in our world. So you see, he's developing ideas of tolerance and a kind of pluralism, of engaging a multiplicity of views, but not as a liberal. He's not like a liberal who says, a liberal, which I would count myself, who would say, well, truth is ultimately unknowable, and it's not the business of politics of society to try to decide for people, and so every individual has to be left to like their own truth because that's sort of the most we can justify in terms of social arrangements. He doesn't do that. To him, there is a truth, and it's God's truth, and it's full, and it's rich, and it's multifaceted, because God is multifaceted. To imagine that I can encompass God within the confines of my own mind and my own perspective is idolatrous, and also wrong, because God, by definition, God in his fullness will always evade human understanding. And this is where the Kabbalah comes in, as we'll see next time, because for him, the Kabbalah, this Kabbalah is not just like a mystical sentiment or feeling. Kabbalah is a doctrine which sees different divine energies at work in the world in contradictory, complementary, yin and yang sorts of ways. And it's through that vision of the Kabbalah that he's able to accommodate difference. And also we'll see in terms of, and this is through the specific schools of Lithuanian Kabbalah in which he was trained, to see that divine dynamic of complementarities working its way through history on route to their final resolution. We brought him up to the threshold of the land of Israel, which is where we will pick up with him next week. But we have time for questions. I'm glad to stay here for a time, and I'm really sorry that my my microphone was giving you grief. I'll be wiser about this next week. So please. So are there questions? Let me just see if there are questions.
If anyone has questions, please don't raise your hand, but just write on the chat, because it's hard. We can't let you speak. So please use the chat if you have questions.
Right. Yes. Thank you. Any questions?
Let's give people a chance to have any, and you have any word about next, well, you gave a hint about next week, so we're moving on to Israel, and we'll see some questions coming up.
Yes, so next week, we will be taking him up as he takes up his role as Chief Rabbi of Jaffa and the surrounding colonies, which is to say Chief Rabbi of the new land of Israel, right? There is no Tel Aviv at the time, so being Chief Rabbi of Jaffa is, so to speak, like being Rabbi of Tel Aviv, being Rabbi of New Palestine, the new Eretz Israel, and we're starting to see he becomes a public figure in ways that he wasn't before. These abstract ideas of body and soul and Israel and non-Jews and this and that will actually start informing his practice as a public figure and as a communal rabbi and as a decision maker. And we'll see he starts becoming controversial because, some of you may have or all of you may have noticed by this point, does this sound like a conventional Orthodox rabbi to you, right? This is somebody who's not really, from the beginning, he's, for lack of a better word, he's really frugal. He's a gadol b'Torah. Right? At age 22, he starts this Torah journal, and the most prominent scholars of the day contribute articles to it. Right? He is like a disciple of, the Netziv refers to him as being like his son. Right? It's some of the most prominent rabbis of the day just see him as their protege and disciple. When you read his works, you see he has a remarkable command of halakha, of Talmud, of rabbinic literature, of Bible, of philosophy, of Jewish philosophy, and he's also reading Western philosophy. And he starts putting this unconventional mix into practice with really interesting results. Okay, now I see some folks have some, Dove Green says they probably contributed to the journal in deference to his father-in-law. I'm sure you're right about that, but I don't think it was the entire story. I'm sure you're right about that, but all kinds of prominent rabbis and all kinds of sons-in-law tried to get all kinds of initiatives off the ground. And we see the way in Eastern Europe, he was not thought of as a hugely important rabbi. I mean, that I want to be very clear. He was not thought of as a hugely important rabbi in Eastern Europe, and by the time he left Eastern Europe, he was already 38 years old. He was, I think, sort of by the time his late 30s rolled around, he was very well respected. And viewed as a little offbeat. Yes, I see this sometimes when I thought I was sharing a text, I was sharing a page from Wikipedia. Often when I teach by Zoom, I try to have one of my daughters nearby because they can, provide live tech support. They have better things to do with their time. But I will be working on getting the hang of it. Now, looking at some of your other questions, how unusual was it for a rabbi to come to Israel at that time? I mean, in some circles, if anybody was going to come to the land of Israel, then you'd think a rabbi, because, they come to but rabbis would regularly come to the land of Israel sort of towards the end of their lives, to sort of study in Jerusalem and sort of be buried in the shade of the holy places. When he said that he was going to the land of Israel, people were very surprised because, again, he hadn't been involved. And I mean, what I brought you from Yishuv is just one testimony that we have of others. So there wasn't mass migration, especially because it was very hard to earn a living there. I mean, most of the people who were migrating to the land of Israel at around this time in 1904, I mean, we're going to talk a lot about the revolutionaries, the second Aliyah, but they're just a relatively small percentage of the Jews who were coming at the time. Most of the Jews who were coming at the time are leaving the same way they were leaving Russia, because they wanted a better life, they wanted to get away from poverty and anti-Semitism, though it's true that the Jews who leave Russia for Palestine rather than for America tend to be more traditional. And some of them do it very deliberately because they're emigrating from Russia, but they know that in America it will be very hard to live a life as a traditional Jew and land as an observant Jew, and in the land of Israel, it will be easier. The question, did he get smicha from the Aruch HaShulchan? Was he lenient in the areas that the Aruch HaShulchan was, like electricity on Yom Tov? I don't think so. I could double check. The late Rav Eitan Hinken has a wonderful volume all about the Aruch HaShulchan, where he discusses in detail the Aruch HaShulchan's halachic opinions and methodology, and he also discusses his relationship to Rav Kook. And I think that is the place, Rivka, where you would look for that. I mean, I don't think he ever studied with the Aruch HaShulchan. He simply went to the Aruch HaShulchan to receive ordination. And as I think about his response, he doesn't necessarily cite Aruch HaShulchan more than he cites anyone else. Feeling he doesn't cite him all that much. I mean, there are other poskim who he cites a very great deal. Now, I see that there was like one or two. Okay, was the connection to nature something going on in general? I'm thinking of Steiner. Do you mean Rudolf Steiner? At any rate, the connection to nature was very much near the relevant person here is less Steiner and more Tolstoy, right? The Narodniki, back to nature, right? The back to nature thinking, which is very influential for Zionism also. We're going to talk about that next time when we talk about Aaron David Gordon. So thinking about nature and returning to nature, both in romantic terms as well as sort of vitalistic terms, as well as like a way of connecting with the common people, as a way of critiquing modernity, as this like overly technological life. That's very in the world, as well as what Professor Ellie Stern from Yale University has characterized as Jewish materialism, something you find including among very traditional Jewish thinkers, starting in the like 1830s, 1840s, an interest in the material world, not necessarily in Marxist terms of material world, but traditional thinkers starting to pay attention to natural science, starting to pay attention to economics, and that sort of thing. Now, I think there was another question that seemed to be in two parts. The question, did his followers take up that idea of tolerance? In many ways, yes. In other ways, no. And his own conception of tolerance was subtle and complicated. I want to respect people's time. As I check my phone, I see that it's now 6 after 9. Does anyone have any further questions? 1 or 2 more, and we can wrap it up by 10 after. Benji Schwartz, I think I saw you raise your hand earlier. If you're still here or not. All right. Okay. Anything else, or tomorrow over to you?
No, we're good. Thank you very much, Professor Mirsky. It was, I think, an honorary way to mark the seal site for Rav Kook. And we hope to see everyone here next week, Sunday, to continue our study session.
So, if I could interrupt you for a second, I see Yossi Yangan raised his hand, and Yossi's a dear friend of many years, and so I'd love to let him. Yossi, what's your question? Are you still there?
It has to be typed.
No question? Oh, okay. Okay. Well, but it's a pleasure to see you, so to speak, anyway. So, thank you. Well, no, it's just wonderful to see you. So Tamar, thank you very, very much. And thank you, Beria, and thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. And my apologies to yes, Kobe Abelman is just sort of seeing you on Wednesday. On Wednesday through Kehillat Yedidia, I will be giving a little sort of chabura in Hebrew on some of Rav Kook's teachings on tshuva. He said he's a rather unconventional thinker, and sort of had very interesting ideas of tshuva as freedom. Those of you who want to check out on the Kehillat Yedidia website, yedidia.org.il. You can find out more there. And yes, I duly noted about the comments on my poor microphone quality and other technical points, and I'll try to do better by the time we meet next week.